I'm Matt.
And I'm Nate.
And this is Not Quite Religious, a podcast where a Christian pastor and former evangelical turned atheist have conversations about faith, religion, philosophy, and life while drinking coffee.
Welcome to episode 16, where we talk about empiricism, the James Webb Telescope, and God as a logical necessity.
But first, the coffee.
Yeah, it's new.
I brought it this week from Keene, New Hampshire, Terra Nova Coffee, which I lived in Keene for a year and a half, and Terra Nova was my go-to coffee then. Now that I live in Brattleboro, it's Mocha Joe's, but for about a year and a half, it was Terra Nova.
I think I like this better than Mocha Joe's.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people do.
It's really good.
There's a conversation that is brewing. Bad dad joke. There's a conversation in Brattleboro and Keene between which one of these coffee shops, among coffee snobs. So like 6 of us. Which is better, Terra Nova or Mocha Joe's? So I think you're on the majority side. I still prefer Mocha Joe's, but this is a solid 8.5. This is good coffee.
I don't think you've ever given anything higher than an 8.5.
No?
No.
I didn't give the Mocha Joe's a 9?
No.
I'm going to bring the camera in.
We'll have to fact check that, but
I'm going to bring the camera in, and then, because I already know what I'm going to rate it. I'm like, this is the Mocha Joe's French Roast Cameroon. It is a 9.
See, I feel like this is a 9.
Wow.
Yeah. I thoroughly enjoy it.
I'll take that as a compliment, too, because you're usually the one who brews the coffee.
Yeah.
And I did this morning.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I normally don't buy whole bean because I don't have a grinder, so maybe that...
Oh, maybe that has something to do with it. But you know how I'm going to take it? I'm just going to take it that I'm a master...
You're a master
brewer. And that Mocha Joe's is still a better roast. But that I brewed this Terra Nova so well that your mind is blown and you're willing to give it a 9.
I can concede that.
So, empiricism?
Yeah.
James Webb Telescope? God as a logical necessity. In some ways, I feel like this is a dead horse that we've beat, not just on the podcast, but also on the Facebook page, and have really not gotten anywhere with it, and we may not get anywhere with it today. But I just thought maybe there was an opportunity for me to clarify to the audience, even to myself, just continue to sort of talk around this idea, because I think I'm on the minority side of Christians and that might, I think that's sort of halting this conversation, because you and I agree on the nature of science.
Yeah,
I think, and that me, unlike most Christians, especially Orthodox Christians, are not overly concerned with, or don't see the importance of proving rationally, logically the existence of God.
right.
And so
So you're not an apologetics,
right,
McDowell,
right,
like,
or
reasons for God,
William Lane Craig,
Yeah.
or any of those, or even Thomistic,
right.
like people that people respect. I'm just sort of like, I'm okay with being a Christian who's agnostic about not the existence of God, but agnostic about the definition.
Yeah,
of God.
What I find ironic is the only other people Christians that I know that are like don't care about apologetics are hyper reformed people who point to Romans 1 and say like there's no way to convince them anyway because they already know. So
Right.
Don't waste your breath.
Right.
Which is like a completely different angle than you're coming from, but I just find it.
Yeah.
I guess not ironic.
Yeah. So, by all means, if you're listening and you have our email or you're subscribed to our Facebook page and you want to continue to pick my brain about this, I'm more than willing to, be shifted in the way that I think about this. It's not like I'm not even. This is consistent with me, I guess. I'm not even making a case that my point of view is the one that all of you should hold,
Right.
which I guess in and of itself might be confusing to some people.
Yeah, I mean, when we initially started, I think there were people on both sides who were like, yeah, you're going to convince them, you're going to destroy their arguments, and we're like, no, that's like not what we're doing.
Yeah. But I don't even mind if like that's the route that you took. If you were like, oh, I'm going to destroy your arguments.
Yeah.
But it's hard to do a podcast that way when I don't care if I don't have arguments in the classic sense. I guess what I'm arguing for is that, and against, is not, I'm not arguing for a proof positive existence of God or that Christianity is logically compelling. What I'm arguing against is an absolute negation of the plausibility of religion, Christianity, theism. And what I'm hoping to point to is that people are wired differently, and that for some people, well, first of all, there is an inherent beauty in Christianity. I still believe that, and that the people who can access that beauty, their lives are enriched because of it. And I think that's the apologetic. I don't know if there's a name for it, but that's the apologetic that I'm aiming for, is that if you're thinking about being a Christian, you're not thinking about a bad thing, despite the fact that there are a plethora of examples of people who are Christians and doing it badly.
Yeah, and I think that's where one of the places we disagree, because I think religion is poisonous, like regardless of, and we did talk about like, what about that guy who only got sober? And I was like, well, it stole his dignity of him being able to get sober in his own strength, and as attributing it to some deity that is not provable. And I think like in the email exchange, you had sent me a Google Doc about your thoughts on this podcast. And one of the things that stuck out to me is you're like, you're an atheist, which makes no sense because you're not an atheist. Mm-hmm. And sort of what I think is, well, there's like, theism's been the default for at least 5,000 years-ish, depending on how you view actual old pagan traditions.
Except for Epicureanism,
yeah,
which historians can fact check me here. I think Epicureanism it's been around for a long time. It's essentially materialism. It's a Greek version of materialism, and it was a minority, but it wasn't a vast minority, and I think that's comparable to atheists in the United States. It's a minority, but it's not a It's not like you say that and it's the same thing as hearing about a Wiccan in Kansas, Right.
So I guess my point, though, is I adopt the term atheist for myself because there's no other box for people to understand my worldview very quickly. So I'm not like... It's not the same as an atheist because the majority of people don't believe in fairies. And if they did, and I didn't, then atheist might make sense as a term.
Right. I guess what I was more pointing to in the doc that I sent you was like, I was trying to compare what I was actually asking, would I call myself an atheist?
Yeah.
That's the thought experiment I was doing. Because I don't believe fairies are real.
Right.
I don't believe fairies exist. So does that make me an atheist? Well, if you were to ask me about the possibility of fairies existing, whether or not I thought it was possible that I could, encounter a fairy, and if I did, would I question my senses or my what's the word I'm looking for?
Cognition.
My sanity. Yeah. If I did, or would I just accept it as reality? I probably am holding out the possibility of there being fairies in a different way than, say, I'm holding out on the possibility of the Earth being flat. In other words, the interesting thing is like I'm more convinced that the Earth is spherical than I am. I'm more convinced that the Earth is not flat than I am that there are no fairies.
Yeah, and I think that's where skepticism and empiricism have more value than religion, right? Because also, it's an atheist trope, but I think it is worth mentioning. Like, you're an atheist on every god but yours.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you don't believe Thor actually exists. You don't believe Vishnu or Krishna or, the pantheon of Aztec gods or Zeus or Jupiter. Like you're not delving in to see if those things are reality. You're just like, well, that's silly, right?
I don't know. I don't know. Let's say I guess that's what I'm saying, and it's far-fetched, and I sound like a blathering idiot at this point. But if Thor came to me in a dream, I would have to reevaluate. Or if I saw Thor on the street, somebody was like, "Hey, I'm Thor," and they were dressed like Thor, I'd be like, "Most likely you're a crazy person," okay. But, and that's probably what I would think in all honesty.
Yeah.
I guess I'm talking about, and maybe it's a lazy argument, but to me, the prefix atheist, atheist, athorist, is an absolute. And that, so maybe it's semantics.
Yeah, I think partially it is a little bit. There's also like the Dawkins scale of atheism, right? Which I definitely fall on I think it's 5, hard 5. I forget if it goes from 5 to 1 or 1 to 5.
Can you explain what a 10 is versus like what?
I think it only goes to 5.
Oh, okay.
But it's like,
Oh, so you're.
I'm hard like God doesn't.
Okay, gotcha.
Like maybe there's a minute possibility, but the amount of proof would need to be so overwhelming that I probably can't be convinced in this lifetime.
Right.
Where like the person, let's just say it goes from 1 to 5 for argument's sake, where 5 is the hardest. Richard Dawkins, 4 horsemen of the apocalypse lived there, right? Harris and 0, 1 would be like, I don't know, but it doesn't seem like your religious book makes sense. And 2 would be like, it's probably more likely than not that any god that humans have devised is not true. And 3 would be like, right. So it goes from like the soft atheism, which would be more agnosticism of like, I don't know, but I'm not convinced of the proof you're giving me, to a hard, like, nope, not necessary, not logically necessary. Like, it's all BS. Yeah. Materialism explains it all.
So then what is absolute then?
Energy?
No, I meant the
in both forms.
I meant what's the definition of absolute? I guess what I'm asking is there such a thing as in the universe as possibility 0%?
I'll have to check my quantum mechanics. There is 0% chance of matter escaping a black hole.
0%.
0%.
Okay.
Like, it can't. Now, the strain, or let me not say matter, let me say information. Okay, because that's like, because black holes do radiate, but the means by which they do it is not like the same particle that went in gets expelled out. Once something goes into a black hole, all information about that entity has disappeared forever. There is 0 probability or possibility of ever getting it back.
So, what if it were to miraculously happen?
I mean, it can't.
Okay.
Like, the laws of the universe would have to change so drastically that the universe itself would probably get destroyed. And, like, that sounds like ridiculous hyperbole, but when you start getting into the math and ripples in space-time and fields, like, it like, I mean, I suppose you could say there's a God who contains that ripple effect only, like, but you have to go to such, like, extraordinary means that all of a sudden you're just babbling, and it's like completely incoherent, I think.
So I might be getting my philosopher wrong here, but I believe that it's Descartes and probably other Greek materialists who have had similar thoughts about the difference between something materially existing and something existing in the imagination, existing in the mind, conceptually.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a weird thing. The human mind is able to imagine impossibilities.
Yeah, but...
Which is why you can invent stories about almost anything that you can imagine.
Yeah, but I don't know where you're going with this, but I would put in the caveat that you've never imagined anything that doesn't have a grounding in reality. So, like, unicorns, right? They don't exist, they're magical, but we know of things that fly, we know of things that look like horses, and we know of things with horns, right? So even, like, the description of angels in the Old Testament, like, lots of eyes, really big, there's, like, some grounding in, like, you can't imagine something that you've never experienced.
So what about God, then?
I mean, he's grounded in the reality of what humans are, right? So Elohim is like walking around the garden, like that just looks like a pretty big person, right? All of the pantheon of ancient gods, right? Like when you look at Egyptian gods or Hindu gods or, the Roman Greek pantheon, like Norse gods, they all have human characteristics. Even the God of the Old Testament, he starts to evolve into some sort of other thing, but initially he's just a sky god. And probably worshipped amongst other gods, and eventually sky god wins. Right? So now you have this cosmic dad in the sky who still has human characteristics. Like, there's nothing in the Bible that shows he doesn't have human characteristics. In fact, it's just the opposite. Sometimes, even with a poetry language, attributing feet and arms and swords and... Right?
It's interesting, though, that when Christians talk about the God of the Old Testament, that they insist that all of those things are anthropomorphisms. In other words, that's not God as he truly is. That's God condescending in order to make himself understandable. Which implies that this view of God, which is what I was taught from a young age in one of the first things I was taught about God and his attributes, is that God is spirit and that God is invisible, and that this is fundamental to who he is in essence.
Yeah.
And that any descriptive is the it's the prophet's attempt to, or the apostles' attempt to make God digestible to the human mind. And so
so then, but to push back, I don't think that ancient Greeks or Hindu actually think Krishna has thousands of arms and right, is that Vishnu? Not right. Like they would also say Thor is transcendent, right? Like Zeus is able to be invisible. He's able to take the form of animals. He's able to take the form of a human.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, he's also something other.
Okay.
Right. So I don't think that's unique to Christianity.
Something non-human.
Yeah.
To say that he's a god is to say that he's not human.
Right. But I don't think it's like Christians have this monopoly on, all the descriptions of God are just God trying to step down and, anthropomorphize himself so that he's understandable. I think it's far more likely to go the other way, where people are like, lightning's really scary. What is that? Oh, it's a thing like us who's just bigger than us, and they control it, and they're mad.
Yeah, but at the end, that developed into an imagination of God that was ineffable, eternal, spirit, infinite, transcendent. If it did, whether it started there or not, the point is that if it's the human mind is capable of imagining that which it cannot put into words without somehow compromising it. In other words, human beings imagine an idea of the transcendent, imagine an idea of that which is beyond. Just this idea that like there are things beyond our understanding, and I think that there's a difference between what materialists, scientists, empiricists mean when they say there are things beyond our understanding, and what theists mean when there are things beyond our understanding. I think that the scientific point of view is there are things beyond our understanding which we may come to understand as a species. But theists are often making a dogmatic point in that there will always be things beyond human understanding.
So the materialists would say there will always be things as well. It's like there's actually a mathematical proof that there are mathematical statements, conjecture, that cannot be proved.
Fair enough. Yeah.
All right. So we had to take a quick break, which our listeners wouldn't know, but
right.
in case we take a hard left right now, just want to let everyone know, like we took a break recording. Everyone's home for the summer, so we've been lucky enough to have the living room mostly to ourselves.
Yeah.
But
is there a way we can edit where we're like, okay, we're going to take a break and then pause it and then have some... We could do like radio silence or something?
Yeah, I'm sure there is.
And then...
I'm sure we could like figure out how to put ads in the middle of it too, like real professional podcasts.
We could just do like a short break and then like find some sort of elevator music on my phone and then play it while it's paused and then, hey, we're back. What were we talking about? Do you guys remember? Oh, wait, this is a podcast. You have no idea what we're talking about. Which is, if you've been listening this long, you know that to already be the case. That we have.
All right, so empiricism, James Webb Telescope, taking breaks, elevator music.
Yeah. Materialism. I think a way to sum up the question that we're asking, and it's really a classic question, is whether or not something exists only materially, and therefore, if I can imagine it, it exists in some sort of material form, in some capacity, somewhere. It has existed, it will,
or it's a compilation of things that existed.
Yeah.
Because right? Like I wouldn't claim that unicorns ever existed.
Right.
But horses, rhinos, and birds do.
The form of the unicorn in the horses and donkeys does exist, and so there's something to base it on. It isn't a unicorn doesn't exist in the mind out of thin air.
Yeah.
Versus the idea that that simply imagining something is a form of existence on its own. So I guess it's the classic question: do things exist does everything that exists exist in a material way, or does everything that exists exist essentially in a mind or in the mind? Is that like a fair? It's kind of a classical, modern.
Yeah, like Aristotle versus Plato type deal.
Sort of, yeah. I guess that relates because Plato's like, because Plato's like, if it exists, there's a form of it, ideal form.
Yeah, maybe it doesn't quite fit.
Not quite, because you're admitting like there's a form of unicorn, right? Maybe not. Right. You wouldn't say it's ideal. You wouldn't say the horse is the ideal unicorn, or vice versa. Maybe some people would say the unicorn is the ideal horse. I don't know. I prefer my horses without horns.
Yeah, maybe the Pegasus is the ideal, because it gets to fly.
But there's something platonic there.
Yeah.
In that. But all that means to me is that like Plato and Aristotle have had such a huge influence on thought.
Yeah, Western thought, at least.
Western thought in particular, that we're even talking about.
Yeah,
this.
and I mean, I think it's no doubt to our listeners that I fall into you can't imagine, like, everything's material.
Yeah.
And you don't.
I can't help but find that to be so... it's the same thing with the atheism thing. It's like it's so absolute. I feel like that things like emotions and spirit and spiritual experiences that people have, whether induced by psychedelics or not, I think they can be explained materially.
Yeah.
But even then, there's just, for me, still the question hanging over that is like, what do we mean when we say, maybe this is getting ridiculous. What do we mean when we say material? Like, the fact that you can explain something materially doesn't get you to the end of the question of existence, which is what we're talking about.
Yeah, so I think my pushback would be you just have a God of the gaps argument there, right?
Yeah.
So like initially lightning was caused by gods and rain was caused by sacrificing or not, and then we figured out like no, there's weather patterns and the sun heats up certain parts of the earth and it causes ocean currents that drive these storms that start in the Sahara and then move all the way over. They're called hurricanes, right? So like at some point, like the gap has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Like we know that God's not holding up the firmament anymore. You don't need, the stars aren't placed there. Like the sun isn't being dragged by, is it Perseus? No, not Perseus. Who's the like Icarus flew too high and melted because the god is like the sun is like a chariot, right? And it's driving around the sky.
Yeah.
But you don't need that. Like so more and more and more, you don't need God to explain how molecules form, besides abiogenesis, like we know exactly how evolution works, we know exactly how speciation happens. So you don't need God to create everything in 6 days. So like at what point do you just say, okay, everything so far, the more we learn, has had a materialistic explanation that the things that we don't know yet, like probabilistically, also have a materialistic explanation. And I would even say spiritual experiences, like there are lots of really good explanations on why people see ghosts, why people have near-death experiences, why people have spiritual experiences. We talked before about like mass hypnosis. So like if there's an explanation for why you see Thor walking down the street, and it's either a crazy person, someone who is playing a prank, or potentially you're hallucinating, but we have naturalistic explanations that don't require an actual god named Thor to be walking down the actual street. And even though there's a potential non-zero probability that it's him, it's so small to say why. Yeah,
I'll harken back earlier to something you said when I basically asked the question about the end of explanation, right? Like maybe you can remember what I'm trying to say. Like so I basically said for theists, God is always there's always something beyond our understanding by definition.
Mm-hmm.
And then you responded the same is true for materialists.
Yeah, there are mathematical conjectures that can be shown to never be provable.
Which is to hypothesize that this debate that we're having is itself infinite. Between theism and atheism, because the very problem with the God of the Gaps argument is the proof that there will always be people who will potentially infinitely, as long as history, as long as our species is here, as long as there's consciousness.
Yeah.
There will be people, entities, deferring to the God of the gaps, because there will always be gaps.
Well, but I think the difference is like I should have looked up the theorem. Like, it's actually verifiable that there are conjectures we can't prove. So there's actually proof that there are certain mathematical statements that can't be proven.
Okay, so is there proof that God can't be proven?
I mean, so I would say the burden, though, so here is on the theist to prove that their particular God exists. Now, to go back to the mathematical conjecture, the theorem doesn't tell us which mathematical theorems are unprovable, right? So if you have a theorem and it's a mathematical conjecture, you're like, I don't know if it's provable or not. You set out to prove it, and if you do, it turns out that it's not one of the unprovable ones, right? I don't know if that answers.
I don't know if that answers my question, but I think it's good. It's good information.
Right, because I think ultimately, like, when we've had dialogues on email or Facebook or in person, it comes, the argument for God always comes back to, yeah, but you need a starting place. You need something to get everything.
Yeah, which is not I don't think that's my argument. So, I mean, but I don't mind you bringing it up because it's a lot of our listeners who are theists. Right. That's the ontological argument for God.
Yeah.
But, we've talked about it before, and I think this is probably maybe another podcast, maybe 3 episodes away, because I do feel like we're beating this horse. But we can get deeper into it. We've said this before. Into the argument from consciousness, because even you said, like, that's the one that may be your best.
That's probably the hardest thing to explain from a naturalistic perspective. Right. Except the Google bot is now sentient. If you want to believe the employee who's...
Yeah, if I want to believe the employee, I choose to... What's the employee's name?
I forget.
Whatever his name is, let's say Bob. I'm an A-Bobist.
Well, no, you're not, because you believe Bob exists.
I believe Bob exists. Whatever his ideology is, I'm against it.
Well, no, he was part of the AI team for Google. Yeah. And was like, this thing is actually, like, conscious. Yeah. It's not replying with, programmed things. And And honestly, Facebook had the same problem 2 years ago, where they legit unplugged 2 machines because they had invented their own language and were talking back and forth, and we didn't know what they were saying. Now, it could have been gibberish, but it's also like, I'm convinced that the singularity is very close, and the singularity in computer science talk is artificial intelligence will become sentient and then probably most likely destroy humanity. And so, like, I think where that gets interesting is if we create something that has sentience, I think that even further denecessitates the idea of God. And I think some people are going to say, oh no, but we did it, right? But there were naturalistic explanations for how we created consciousness.
So a sentient... So you could hypothesize then that a sentient but non-eternal being created us.
Sure.
Hypothetically.
Right, but you don't need that being to be non-materialistic.
Right. And then the question, we're back to Anselm every single time. Who created that?
Right.
That being that was material. Okay. Then who created that being?
Yeah.
Right. So on and so forth. Which doesn't prove, again, we're just rehashing, which doesn't prove the existence of a specific entity called Yahweh or Allah
Right.
or Jesus or whatever. But it does get us into territories that you call the gaps. It gets us into territories of where we're only talking hypothetically.
Yeah, but I think that's religion, right? Because it comes down to like God did it, God created everything, and like the atheist is like, well, who created God? Mm-hmm. And then Christians and apologists come up with really clever words to show that, to skirt the question and just say, well, nothing has to create God. He's always been eternal. And I'm like, well, that's the universe. Like, why make another jump?
Then that's pantheism, right? If the universe is God.
But I wouldn't say the universe is God. It just is. I mean, like,
okay.
if you're saying the only characteristic of God is that it creates, like, the universe destroys a lot more than it creates, first. And second, like, it, like, yeah, I mean, we're a happy accident.
Not so happy.
yeah. You know, it's like you look at the James Webb Telescope pictures, right? The picture of the far-off galaxies that has been circulating on Facebook is like those hundreds of galaxies that we can see with the James Webb. I mean, potentially, probably a lot more, because what we thought we saw with Hubble, it turns out, you know, there's like 10 times what we can see with the James Webb. And if we were able to build a better telescope, there's probably even more galaxies that we can't see with the James Webb, right? So you have hundreds of galaxies in this picture, and it turns out that picture is the size of a grain of sand held at arm's length pointed at the sky. How many, I mean, the arc length of that is minimal. Like, how many grains of sand held at arm's length would it take to cover your entire field of vision for the night sky? And then remember that there's also a southern hemisphere, right? And there's trees and stuff in your way, so like maybe in the Pacific Ocean, in the middle of it, where there's absolutely nothing, right? You'd see it, and then you have to remember so, like, we're talking so many billions upon trillions of stars, most of which have planets. A percentage of them have what we would consider to be habitable. And we're going to postulate that God made all of that so that he can make sure we don't, like, kill our neighbor. like, it's just so preposterous to me when you have this, you know, giant universe that can, like, yeah. I don't know, I think we just took a hard left, although we did say we're going to talk about the James Webb.
No, I think that was a beautiful segue. I wasn't going to say it, because when you mention it, then you ruined the beauty. But since you brought up a left turn, I thought, no. That was not a hard left turn. That was masterfully done in terms of segueing. Well, I don't know. I think there's a bit of a straw man there, because I would agree that it's preposterous to claim that a very specific God, a very specific interpretation of God from the Hebrew Bible, you know, it created all of that and possibly even more.
Not possibly. 100%.
Yeah.
Like,
definitely.
we know that the universe is bigger than the visible universe.
Right. The universe definitely is bigger than the visible universe, and possibly expanding. Or definitely expanding. Definitely expanding.
Possibly infinite.
Possibly infinite. So, also that he could, you know, hand down rules to people about, you know, not killing each other.
Or what kind of things in the ocean they can and cannot eat.
I don't know that there's anybody that would claim that God's purpose for, you know, any theist would claim that God's purpose for creating was to manage people's diets and their politics. What I've been arguing from the beginning is that And this is strangely and ironically what I think we agree on. So that's why I'm calling this sort of a straw man, because we agree that religion was a social necessity. In that I look at the Bible as one people's, particularly the Hebrews people, explanation of how to get along in the Near East. And I don't think that's a bastardization of the text, and I don't think that compromises, Orthodox theology. It's also, on an existential level, an explanation of why we suffer, which you understand immediately why suffering requires an explanation, because it's readily apparent that suffering sucks and we'd rather not do it. And so there's an existential reason.
Let me push back, because on previous podcasts, your position is suffering is the starting point. So if it is the starting point, then you don't need an explanation for it, though. It just is.
No, what I'm saying is that suffering is the starting point for a discussion about what makes the Bible relevant. The existence of suffering is why religion, not just the Bible, is why I think all religion exists. So the starting point isn't the starting point isn't God definitely exists. Okay, what am I talking about? The starting point.
Sorry, I derailed you.
The starting point of theology, the presupposition of good theology, in my opinion, isn't the existence of God. And I think that for people for whom it is the existence of God, the arguments that you made are, if they are compelling, and I find them to a great degree compelling, then the foundation of their entire worldviews questioned, right. and you would say destroyed. But what I'm saying is, like, where I start is a philosophical question. And if we're talking about, like, the goodness and the beauty and the legitimacy of something like Christianity, but I would apply it I would do this with comparative religion, like comparing Christianity to Buddhism or Hinduism or Judaism or Islam. Like, which of these gives us the most compelling reason to live and the most compelling way of getting on in the universe? So when you say it's preposterous that God would create a universe just so that he could hand down laws,
well, I guess
what I would say is those laws were created in order to order those societies to which they attributed to something transcendent in order to codify them and enforce them. And I don't think you would disagree with that.
Yeah, I guess when I'm saying preposterous as well, I'm not just saying... I'm saying, like, the universe is so gigantic. Like, we can't even begin to imagine how big it is. There has to be other life out there. Right?
Okay.
I don't believe in aliens in the way that, spaceships have come here and they help build the pyramids. Like, I also think that steals humanity away from the actual builders of the pyramids, who were modern humans, in every sense of the word. But, so if there's other life, other sentient life, are there different rules for those species? Or do we need to go be missionaries to, Alpha Centauri because, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and there's no way to the Father except through him? Like, what do you do with that?
I guess it depends on what your theology is.
Well, but I think materialism answers it, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a small probability that life will exist, but given enough time in a big enough universe, it's guaranteed. And it's probably guaranteed more than once. Where I think most theology can't even begin to wrestle with that question. Because all the religions that I've seen are human-centric. Right, and people are going to be like, no, Christianity is God-centric. No, it's not. It's about you. It's about how you should live, right? So it doesn't actually speak to aliens. It doesn't speak to other, species. It's human.
Yeah. The question is how would Christian theology respond to the existence of aliens?
Right. And Lewis tries to answer this in the Space Trilogy.
Yeah.
But
yeah. Which admittedly I haven't read. I'm familiar with.
I think it's one of the weaker of his works, honestly. Read Till We Have Faces. I think that's the pinnacle of Lewis.
I love Till We Have Faces.
Yeah.
That's good stuff. I recommend it. I still think we're talking past each other here, and and that you're talking to a certain portion of my audience, but not actually to me. It doesn't trouble me to say that that religion is man-made. That's not a problem for my worldview. I wonder, and I know we're coming up against the clock here, and this may be a good teaser. I wonder if there's the difference here is not fundamentally theological, but fundamentally philosophical, and between you and I. And I recall something that you said a few podcasts ago that doesn't strike me as just a throwaway statement, although we didn't develop it, which is that you find that philosophical statements, once they get to a certain point, are purely semantical, and not useful.
Yeah,
I think that's the difference between you and me, is that I don't know that. Well, useful. I actually don't care too much about utilization, but I don't think I would argue that philosophy is perpetually useful. But I would argue that I'm perpetually interested in talking about it, and that I don't think that it is ever going away, and that I think there's, I don't know if useful is the right term, but I think there's something meaningful and necessary about human beings continuing to dialogue about the meaning of things. Even if it's semantical, there's something in the exchange that's worth it.
Yeah. So
it's valuable.
We are coming against the clock, but I want to quickly... I'm going to be called a postmodernist for this by some... I don't necessarily think philosophy is not valuable. I mean, obviously, we're doing a podcast every week where we talk philosophy. And before the podcast, we would get together and just do this. I think there is a point at which philosophy can... Logic can be... contain itself and have consistency within logic, but lead to completely wrong conclusions. So at some level, at some point, what I want to say about philosophy and logic is they stop working. And so what do we have left? If you want to talk about capital T truth, I'd say energy and matter. Like we can replicate the same experiment over and over and over in different parts of the world, different places in the universe, and get the same results. You can't do that with philosophy. Because even now we're talking past each other, right? So there's two people who are both in New England, come out of a post-Christian culture, and we can't agree. But if we both measured big G gravity, I don't care where in the universe, we would get the same answer. So, as we talk about capital T truth, this is where I feel like materialism has the better stance, where it's we can actually measure. And theists are we can think about it.
Can I end the podcast with an open-ended question?
Yeah.
For us and
let's do it.
and the audience. How is knowing only about energy and matter good for the soul?
Yeah, I want to answer it, but we can let that lie for another week.
Yep.
Thanks for listening, guys. Coffee, in my opinion, is a 9. Matt only gives it an 8.5, but that's probably because he is biased in his Brattleboro-ness. And
Jeff, who is the roaster, I hope you're listening. That'd be awesome if you were. I don't expect that you do, but we both love your coffee. Nate loves it slightly more. Thanks, Jeff.
Have a great week, everyone.